today I'm going to be presenting Unskilled and Unaware of It, how difficulties in recognizing one's own incompetence leads to inflated self-assessment.
So complicated.
On January 6, 1995, Professor Wheeler and Clifton Earl Johnson robbed two banks in the greater Pittsburgh area at gunpoint. Neither robber wore a mask or otherwise attempted to disguise themselves, having instead applied lemon juice to their faces. According to Wheeler, Johnson had told him lemon juice would make one invisible to security cameras in the same way that invisible ink works. Although initially skeptical, Wheeler had tested this method by covering his face with lemon juice and capturing an image with a Polaroid camera. As he was missing from the resulting photograph, he trusted the method to be effective. Detectives later speculated that his absence in the image was caused by either a faulty film, a malfunctioning camera, or Wheeler having unintentionally pointed the camera. Johnson was arrested on January 12th, and a surveillance photograph of Wheeler was broadcast as part of a Pittsburgh Crime Stoppers segment with the 11 o'clock. Anonymous tips subsequently led to Wheeler's arrest, which occurred less than an hour after the broadcast, and when shown the photographs in which he had been identified, Wheeler was shocked and exclaimed, "But I wore the lemon juice. I wore the lemon juice." Johnson pleaded guilty to the heist as well as two unrelated robberies from 1994. He testified against Wheeler and was given a 5-year prison sentence. Wheeler, on the other hand, was sentenced to 24 and a half years. So a brief account of the robberies was included in the 1996 edition of the World Almanac. Dr. David Dunning, a professor of social psychology at Cornell, discovered this story and came to believe that if Wheeler was too stupid to be a bank robber, perhaps he was also too stupid to know that he was too stupid to be a bank robber. That is, his stupidity protected him from an awareness of his own stupidity. With his graduate student, Justin Kruger, who has since graduated, he organized a research program to determine whether someone's perceived competence could be measured against their actual competence, and subsequently they authored the paper that we were reading. So what's the big idea? To answer that question, we must first define metacognition. Some of you may already know, cognition is the mental processes we use to take in, store, and use information. And metacognition is thinking about those thoughts and your awareness of control over the cognitive process. Incompetence comes with metacognitive blind spot. When people are incompetent in their strategies they adopt to achieve success and satisfaction, they suffer dual burden. Not only do they reach erroneous conclusions and make unfortunate choices, but their incompetence robs them of the very ability to realize that they are. Instead, like Mr. Wheeler, they're left with the mistaken impression that they're doing just fine. And this process has become known as the Dunning-Kruger. All right, so here's some important things we need to consider. First, this paper focuses on the metacognitive skills of the incompetent, explaining in part why people often seem to be imperfect in appraising themselves' abilities. Perhaps the best illustration of this tendency is the above average effect, or the tendency of the average person to believe that he or she is above average, a result that defies basic statistics. For example, high school students tend to see themselves as having more ability in leadership, getting along with others, and written expression than their peers. Business managers view themselves as more able than the typical manager, and football players see themselves as more savvy in the football sense than their teammates. Therefore, you can see that this discrepancy in self-assessment can lead to trouble engaging one's own capabilities. The existing research is consistent with the notion that individuals who are incompetent lack the metacognitive skills necessary for accurate self-assessment. And work on the nature of expertise, for instance, has revealed that novices possess poor metacognitive skills than do experts. For example, in physics, novices are less accurate than experts at judging the difficulties of physics problems. In chess, novices are less calibrated than experts about how many times they need to see a given chess position before they are able to reproduce it correctly. And students who perform poorly on tests are less accurate in predicting which questions they get right than our students. So here are the hypotheses. First, they hypothesize that competent individuals, when compared with their more competent peers, would dramatically overestimate their ability and performance relative to objective criteria. Second, they hypothesized that competent individuals would suffer from deficient metacognitive skills in that they would be less able than their more competent peers, to recognize competence when they see it, be it their own or anyone. Third, they hypothesized that competent individuals would be less able than their more competent peers to gain insight into their true level of performance through social comparison. In particular, because of their difficulty recognizing competence in others, competent individuals would be unable to use information about the choices and performances of others to form more accurate impressions of their own. And lastly, they hypothesized that the competent could gain insight about their shortcomings, but that this comes paradoxically by making them more competent, thus providing them with the metacognitive skills necessary to be able to even realize the difference. So the authors explored their prediction using 4 studies. In each, they presented college students at Cornell University with tests that assess their ability in a domain in which knowledge, wisdom, and savvy were important. First, participants were asked to assess their perceived performance, and then they were tested. They hypothesized that participants would overestimate their abilities and performance relative to that objective criteria, but more specifically, that those who proved to be incompetent or those scoring in the bottom quartile of the distribution would be unaware that they had performed. Of course, this could be the result of the fact that participants who scored poorly would statistically have a better chance of overestimating their performance than underestimating it. So the real question becomes, how much would those who score poorly be miscalibrated with respect to their performance? They also wanted to examine the relationship between miscalibrated reasonability and metacognitive skills. For example, in study 4, participants not only estimated their overall ability, but also indicated which specific test items they had answered correctly and incorrectly. And lastly, they wanted to determine which experiences or interventions would help low performers recognize the true level of performance that they had achieved. For example, in study 3, participants were asked to reassess their ability after seeing their peers' responses. The idea being that competent individuals would learn from observing the responses of others. Competent participants would not. So we'll talk a little bit about study 1. In study 1, the authors had asserted that humor requires a sophisticated set of skills, knowledge, and wisdom to gauge the tastes and reactions of others. And as a result, participants were asked to rate the humor of a series of jokes presented to them in a 30-eyed list. Their answers were compared against the answers of a group of professional comedians in order to roughly determine the participants' ability to spot humor. Now, out of all the participants, the average self-reported ability to recognize humor fell into the 66%, a full 16 points higher than the actual true. And looking specifically at the bottom quartile, the lowest scoring 25% of the distribution, participants' average score was in the 12th percentile. When asked to assess how well they thought they had done, they placed themselves in the 58th percentile on average, a full 46 points higher than the true score. Interestingly, though, those scoring in the highest quartile actually underestimated. So ultimately, the first study demonstrates that all performers think that they are doing better than they actually are. For poor performer, that discrepancy is much lower. Okay, so study 2, the whole purpose of study 2 was to replicate the results of study 1, but in a different area of ability. Participants were asked to complete 20 law school exam questions. Afterward, they were asked to compare their general logical reasoning ability with that of the other students in the study by providing a percentile. They were also asked to estimate how their score on the test compared to that of the other students in the study. And finally, they were asked how many of the 20 questions they thought they had answered correctly. Again, on average, all participants reported logical reasoning ability in the 66th percentile. And when you focus specifically on the bottom quartile participants who scored at the 12th percentile on average, they believed that they had actually scored at the 68th percentile general logic skill and 62nd percentile on the test, 56 points and 50 points higher than their true scores, respectively. Additionally, although they correctly answered only 9.6 questions on average, they believed that they had answered 14.2 questions correctly, nearly 50% difference. Again, high performers believe they did worse than they actually did. point that we'll get to here in the following slides. And finally, the results of study 2 replicated the findings of study 1, but in study 3 was conducted in 2 phases. In phase 1, participants were given a 20-item test on grammar ability. Each item contained a sentence with a specific portion underlined, where participants were asked to judge whether the underlined portion was grammatically correct. After completing the test, participants compared their general ability to identify grammatically correct standard English with that of other students in their class on the same percentile scale used in the previous studies. As in study 2, participants also estimated the percentile rank of their test performance among their student peers, as well as the number of individual test items they had correct. On average, all participants reported a grammar ability in the 71st percentile and a test score of 68%, 21 and 18 points higher than the true statistical average. Bottom quartile participants, although actually scoring in the 10th percentile, reported an average general grammar in the 67th percentile. A score on the test in the 61st percentile and an average of 12.9 questions correct on the test, which when they actually only answered 9.2 questions correctly, 57, 51, and 3.7 point discrepancy. Top quartile participants underestimated themselves again in both general grammar ability and the score on the test, although not in the number of questions they answered correctly. This phase of study 3 replicated the results of both studies 1 and 2, but in the 3rd domain. Phase 2 of study 3 was conducted several weeks before the first phase, several weeks after the first phase. The bottom and top quartile performers were invited back to the lab where they were given 5 of their peers' grammar tests to grade, and they were asked to assess how well each test taker had done the test. Afterward, they were given the opportunity to reassess their performance, scoring hypothesis 3, that competent individuals failed to gain insight into their own competence by comparing themselves with others. As predicted, participants who scored in the bottom quartile were less able to gauge the competence of others than their top quartile counterparts. An analysis of the grade given by the grader and the actual score revealed a correlation of 0.37 for bottom quartile participants and 0.66 for upper quartile participants. They found similar results by summing the absolute miscalibration grades. In addition, after bottom quartile participants graded their 5 papers, they developed a slightly inflated view of how they performed, meaning that after seeing the more competent choices of their peers, they still thought they did extremely well or even better than their first estimate. Top quartile participants, after realizing how well they had performed in comparison to other test takers, raised their estimation of their own abilities. The authors thought that this might be due to the false consensus effect, which is the tendency to overestimate the extent to which others share our abilities and skills among them. And this demonstrates that competent individuals often fail to improve their own competence after observing competence in others, whereas competent individuals tend to learn. In the final study, the authors aimed to determine if competence training improved performance and self-assessment. Participants were asked to complete 10 logic problems. After taking the test, they rated their logical reasoning skills and performance relative to their classmates on a percentile scale, and they also estimated the number of problems they had solved correctly. Next, a random selection of half the total of participants pool was given logical training, while the remaining half was given an unrelated filler group. Afterward, both groups reviewed their own tests and indicated which problems they thought they had answered correctly and incorrectly, and compared themselves to their peers. Prior to training, participants displayed a pattern of results strikingly similar to that of the previous 3 studies. First, participants overall overestimated their logical reasoning ability, with an average percentile of 64th and 61st in test performance relative to them. Participants also overestimated their raw test score, with an average of 6.6 perceived and 4.9 actual. Once again, individuals scoring in the bottom quartile were oblivious to their poor performance. Although their score on the test put them in the 13th percentile, they estimated their logical reasoning ability to be in the 55th percentile and their performance on the test to be in the 3rd. Participants in the bottom quartile also overestimated their raw test scores. On average, they thought they had answered 5.5 problems correctly. In fact, they had answered an average of 0.3 problems. After receiving the training, participants graded themselves more accurately than their non-trained peers. The difference that was more pronounced when examining the bottom quartile. In fact, the training was so successful that those who had initially scored in the bottom quartile were just as accurate in monitoring their test performance as those who had initially scored in the top. So what's it all mean? This paper suggests that not only does incompetence lead to poor performance, but also the inability to recognize one's own performance is poor to begin with. Across the 4 studies, participants in the bottom quartile estimated their performance 4.64 standard deviations above the average. The cause of this gross overestimation is the lack of the metacognitive skills necessary to determine that one has answered a question correctly or incorrectly. High performers often underestimate themselves due to the phenomenon known as the false consensus effect. They assume that since they perform well, everyone else must have done the same. In other words, competent individuals often fail to recognize their own incompetence, and competent individuals tend to assume that everyone else is just as competent as they. There are several reasons why people fail to learn from their life experiences. One is that they often do not receive negative feedback about their skills and abilities. Another is that some settings do not allow people to receive the necessary self-correcting behavior to learn from their mistakes. And third, even if people do receive negative feedback, they must accurately understand why the failure occurred, want to change it, and know exactly. So as I wrap up, I just want to mention one thing. While I did my best to put this presentation together, the worry that it may contain errors or inconsistencies. That being said, to the extent that this presentation wasn't perfect, it is not something I did wrong.
How would you think that this conclusion might apply to the workplace? What are the practical implications of maybe this happening in a workplace setting?
Yeah, so I think that's a great question. If you fail to realize that you even are making a mistake, then the issues are going to persist, right? So I think what needs to happen is workers, managers, organizations need to come together and figure out what the problems are and create training programs where people can learn from metacognitive mistakes. And when that happens from the ground up, people will start doing the right thing and other people will start.
So, I mean, one difference between the situation these students find themselves in and a workplace is that there are stakes, right? These kids were recruited to participate in this experiment, and their performance, they didn't get any carrot or stick based on their performance in it. So do you think that the results of this might just be driven by the fact that, some people are lazy and they're going to get their extra credit point one way or another?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think I didn't include it in the slide. They did receive some compensation, I think.
They were given 1 bonus point in their course grade because they're just like undergrad students, which is really common practice, for good or for ill.
So yeah, I think that's a good point. Yeah, but I mean, it's as a population, students are going to be a little less not the norm anyways to begin with, right? So that's part of it. Yeah.
So it kind of leads into my question, which is, do you think there are personality characteristics that might vary with this bias?
Yeah, I think maybe people who are more conscientious are going to be more willing to work on their issues, and obviously openness is correlated with neglect. So people who are more open are going to have an easier time recognizing or at least have better metacognitive skills to make the changes they need to make. And people who are neurotic are just going to have a hard time regardless.
Yeah, and I don't know if you're aware or not. I'm not. I'm guessing there have been follow-ups to this study, probably many. Do you know if they followed up on general intelligence and this phenomenon? Because competence is different than intelligence.
Right.
You can be very incompetent in a particular task, but score fairly average or above average on intelligence.
Great question. Yeah, so this article was so long. There was 4 studies in it. I had to figure out methods, all the stuff to be crammed into 15 minutes. And when I did all my test runs, it was always over 15 minutes. So there were
Welcome to personality and social science.
Right.
research.
but I ended up having to cut some of the stuff. They did talk a little bit about competence, expertise, and a couple other things that I wasn't. There are, of course.
So this kind of ties in nicely because both of our questions are really about like the heterogeneity of the participants, right? Like the people who are in the study, do they differ? But another one is kind of a grander cultural context as well. So over in the experimental econ side, a really common experiment is called the ultimatum game. It's where you get 2 players. One player has, say, $10, right? And they say, I'm going to divide this between us. You know, I get 8, you get 2, right? And then the co-player gets to decide whether they reject the offer or they accept the offer. And if they reject the offer, neither of them gets anything, right? It's a really classic game. And this is played with actual money, so there's some stakes about it. And what we find is whenever we do these experiments in different countries with different populations, predominantly of students, right? The degree of generosity and rejection rates massively differ across countries. So the Japan is more generous than the US. And then Israel is more generous than Japan. And you know, there's a few of these kind of things that tend to hold up, and they've tested like multiple cities with multiple populations. And so one thing that kind of gives me pause about this is this kind of a very American college student specific sort of phenomenon? I imagine like this is from what, 99, right?
Yeah.
So like people have done some stuff, but
It has almost 12,000 citations.
yeah.
It's crazy. Yeah, one of the reasons I did this, I found it on Facebook. So like it's pretty popular. A lot of
So there's been a dozen or more studies that have used this in a working populations since 1999. Used the same theories and looked at these kinds of competence versus incompetence, skilled versus unskilled, et cetera. And these patterns generally hold. There are some differences when you get to culture. There are some differences when you look at genders and things of that nature. But the pattern is really consistent, which is why it's cited 12,000 times. The other thing I would mention is this is very common for social psychology to cram 3, 4, 5, 6, 10 studies into one paper. They may do that many studies. It may take them 5 years, 10 years to do and to create one paper because of that. And that's just the way, for whatever reason, social psychology has developed over time. So if you pick a JSPS, or JPSP, sorry, journal article like this, you're gonna see that. So it's very common in that area of psychology to see that sort of pattern. The other thing I will mention is something that we've found pretty consistent, is that students, although they are unique in the situation that they are currently in terms of the context, they're still people. Okay, and most of the things that we find in that population tends to hold with other people, whether they be in workplaces or things like that. So, and that's something that there's been a few very heated conversations at conferences where people have ended up throwing things, including punches, over the generalizability of, or the lack thereof, of students as a population. And so I tend to fall on they're still people, we can learn something from them, but then when you change the context, things will adjust. And then the most powerful and more meaningful things are the ones that even when you do change the context, for some reason they are consistent. And this is one of those studies where when you do change the context, these things still continue to hold. And that's, so it's good to keep in mind that students samples are not a perfect one-to-one match to worker samples. That's very true. But we still absolutely can and do learn quite a bit of cool stuff from convenient samples of students in laboratories.
I was gonna say maybe something too that would be good about like having a student population is you could have like a unique opportunity to like test them at a point of incompetence, and then as you become educated and you learn, then you gain more competence, and so it'd be interesting to see the change in them. So in that sense, they might be a more valuable population because they're gaining competence, and you could test like an individual without, or like with the change in competence.
Yeah, for
And
sure.
that's kind of what I thought this was for with looking at you. So maybe taking that a little further and making an entire study out of it could be cool for actually. Anybody else?
I think I've read some studies that must have come after this study and people who were looking at, I think in that study, graduate students particularly. And some of the things they were talking about weren't in this more generalized study, but they were breaking it down by things like you said, like gender or like socioeconomic status, and found some things that were very interesting, that like women were much more likely to put themselves down than men were in terms of rating their own competence. Or people from like lower income backgrounds, same thing. So I just think it's an interesting thing to consider if you wound up being the employer or the supervisor, to kind of recognize that in your own students. Particularly when, you know, you use feedback like from your employee as part of their feedback, and just to, in a way, kind of account for that in terms of if that goes to like their compensation, for example. You know, not letting people undercut themselves in the process. So it's an interesting effect. It's interesting. But I just thought that was worth.
Yeah, I'd like to see some of those effects later across those things.
I just think it's interesting applying this to the context of health and safety. And apparently, according to Dr. Allen, the results have been, replicated in other studies. The idea that maybe your least competent people with regards to safety are gonna be the most overconfident. Like, oh, I can hop on this forklift and no big deal. And
Yes.
I don't know, just an interesting dynamic that
Yeah.
probably, professionals deal with in the real world.
Yeah, one of the I agree with that. That's one of the reasons why I even picked this article. It's just because everything that's going on politically right now, it's like, you know what I mean? I don't want to get anybody. Kind of work like that.
In terms of the like study for where they trained people out of it, like, do you know of any studies or you yourself personally believe that that could be a long-term effect? I mean, in theory, right, there could be people in this room that watched your presentation and had like that aha moment, right? Like, do you think it's long lasting, or do you think their stupidity makes that a short like, and then they just pivot, you know?
Yeah, I mean, it's a complicated question. It's very situationally dependent, right? I think with a lot of people, ignorance, right? I mean, how many people do you know that like you can tell them that you're blue in the face, provide all the evidence that you have available, and they still think Tylenol causes autism, whatever, So.
So one other question I had, and I know we're out of time on this one, but is the person is maybe unskilled and unaware of it. What is the implication for their coworkers? What should the message be? If I was reading this and I was a coworker and I knew that Joe doesn't really know how to drive a forklift, but he's technically forklift certified. What do I as a coworker should take from this?
So one of the things that we talked about at the end of the discussion was a lot of people fail to learn from their issues because people are so hesitant to give them negative feedback. So like, if I'm doing something wrong, like if after this I did a terrible job presenting, you come up to me and you say, I'm not going to learn. So it's the same thing with everything else. You gotta, as a coworker, I think you need to be willing to give the honest, hard feedback, especially with their driving folks.
Bill, can I just hone in on that? I mean, I think that gets to the hierarchy of controls and
Yeah.
why we engineer out those potentials for the administrative human error component to it. I think it's really kind of drives that home.
Yep, exactly.
think we got one more, but let's try to be quick.
Yeah, I was just gonna ask, I feel like the graphic I've seen most associated with the Dunning-Kruger effect is like the graph. Where they have like, when you know nothing, you're like not confident at all, but as soon as you start learning things, you get like overconfident. And then you like dip down again. Does that come from this study, do you know, or is that like a follow-up
I don't
study?
remember seeing it. I maybe I'd have to see it to know what you're talking about, but I don't remember seeing
Okay, yeah, I flipped through it, I was like, oh, I didn't see the graph thing that I
it. They
see.
had a lot of like line graphs.
Yeah,
stuff.
yeah.
But the main thing that, and the only reason I really included them, because I wanted to demonstrate. Is it not on it? Oh. I kind of wanted to demonstrate fast. Oh, it's not even there. What the heck? Well, I was going to demonstrate something. All right. The whole idea, and the reason why I wanted to include it was because to really just to show that in the top quartile, people underestimated their ability. It's their actual test. And this is their perceived. Everybody else was above by a significant degree, kind of the lower you got actual performance. But they were always under top quartile. So basically, people who did well thought that everybody else was doing just as good as they were, which is kind of strange. But that's the only reason I included that.
All right, we're gonna end it there.
Can everybody hear me? Mic on?
I don't think it's on.
How about now? Better? Too much?
That's good.
Hi, my name is Micah Stratton. I'm a student in a PhD program at occupational injury prevention. And Michael, thank you so much. That was really article. I really enjoyed that. Mine is going to be just a little bit different. But it's the association between an increase in glucose levels and armed conflict-related stress population-based study. And just kind of a personal note, I was reading this article for a literature review over the summer, and it just kind of specifically struck me like, man, I would love to bring this to Journal Club and hear some discussion about it. So that's how we got here today. Background or introduction to the study. What they're trying to study was the war in Israel, between Israel and Palestine in a specific region. And they wanted to know, hey, what's the association between a stress in the environment, and they define stress as mortar fire and the accompanying alert sirens. So what's the relationship between the alert sirens and mortar shell fire and an increased glucose level in like the whole population of people? And then sort of within that question, they wanted to know specifically, how does your diabetes status play into that, whether you have diabetes or not, and how close you geographically live to that conflict. So the thought behind this, we can take a look at this figure here. This isn't the strongest laser pointer, but just like I'm sure everybody is aware of the hypothalamus pituitary adrenal axis, right? These structures in our brain that when there's a stressor in your environment, they activate and they use hormones to signal and communicate to the rest of your body, hey, let's get ready to deal with some stress, increase the heart rate, increase the blood pressure and blood glucose. And that's really what they're showing us here. So like these different structures, we'll send one kind of hormone, acronym for a long name you don't need to be concerned with, but that hormone turns into another one that eventually turns into cortisol. And these stress responses prepare you for the stressful situation. But their thought is, well, if you're in a war zone and this is happening over and over and over again, you're going to have elevated levels of these hormones in your body that just don't do one thing. They don't just turn your heart rate up. They don't just turn your blood pressure up. They have other physiological consequences. And their particular concern was insulin resistance and diabetes. And they wanted to understand how this role of stress plays into that metabolic concern overall. And not only that, but they wanted to do it a little bit different. So a lot of the other literature in the field that they pointed out is really only focused on people who have diabetes. And this population that they studied was predominantly non-diabetic. There was about 30% of the population that did have diabetes, but 70% really did. And then finally, a lot of cohorts being studied in war zones are relatively small, like less than 100 people. And this study had a lot more than 100 people in it. So they sort of set themselves apart and wanted to really try and take a large scale look at this issue. And finally, their study period was 2008 to 2014. So 7 years. That's quite a volume of data. Now, before we talk about like methods and data analysis and stuff, this is kind of what I had to do to like wrap my head around the region, the conflicts, and the context of the population that they're studying. So we're just gonna take a couple of minutes here, and I'm gonna go be my own laser pointer. So their population was in it was the southern region of Israel, and that's we have two different maps here, and this one in the yellow is just showing where the south of Israel is, and then there's the Gaza Strip where Palestinians live. And most of the conflict, and certainly the conflict they were interested in, is centered around this region here. Now I had to find this other map because I was like, oh man, that's like a huge area. But if you look at it, it doesn't have like even distribution in the population. So most of that region really is thinly or not populated at all. And right around the Gaza Strip itself, it's classified as like a rural population, but there are like higher concentration, like urban areas close by. So that was sort of the first main thing, was just understanding the region. And then finally, one of the main ways that they analyzed their data was by separating the population into people who live really close to the Gaza Strip within 7 kilometers and people who live 7 kilometers or more. And that was like a significant point for them. And the reason they set it at 7 kilometers is because you'll see from 2008 to 2012, it was pretty much short range mortars. So these short range mortars, if one of them left the ground and you were in range, you had about 15 seconds to find shelter. Pretty stressful, right? Anything outside of that, maybe you had about 60 seconds, but that's that alert siren that was going to accompany the mortars that they were defining stress. Now they had those conditions kind of change in 2012 to 2014. They saw a lot of like longer range mortars being used. So that was really significant to them because initially when at the early part of their data, it was like, you know, they're really focused on that less than 7 kilometers, those people close to the Gaza Strip. But then with the increased range of those mortars, there was kind of increased exposure for stress for the rest of the population as well. And then just kind of in a general sense of the whole population, about 5% of the population live within 7 kilometers of that Gaza Strip. Okay, let's take a look and see. So they had over 37,000 participants, and the only inclusion criteria is being over the age of 18. Now, if you remember that whole southern region of Israel, there's a public health system there, hospital system. It provides healthcare for about 70% of the 800,000 people that live there. And so the authors of this paper contacted that healthcare system and got access to fasting glucose tests data for that time range of 2008 to 2014. So what that means is, you know, anybody who was going to the hospital anyways to have a medical procedure or routine checkup, if a fasting glucose test was a part of that checkup, their data was stored, and then it was accessed for this study. So those 37,000 participants produced about 408,000 fasting glucose tests. Now, what are you going to do with that many glucose tests? They defined 3 scheduled military operations in that 7-year period. And that's what we see in our table over here. It's the name of it and the days that it happened. It was like documented by the Israeli Defense Force. And these were times of interest because during these military operations, they said those mortar rockets and the accompanying alert sirens were a daily occurrence, if not multiple times a day. So that was their exposure category. There's a lot of mortar fire. And then they said, we're going to compare the glucose tests from those days within these operations to all of the other days in the study, which I'm not great at math, but that's a lot of control days. It's just like 70 days of military operations to the rest of the 7 years. But that's how they did it. And 10% of the glucose tests that they had were taken or reported during these military times. So again, we have our definition of stress here, and let's take a look at how they analyze it. So they took all this data, and in up here, this is almost exactly how they had it presented in the paper. They said, hey, if we had normally distributed data, we used an independent student t-test. Not normally distributed data was Mann-Whitney. Categorical data was chi-square. And then with their actual glucose data, they said, hey, everything was really skewed. So we did a log transformation and then put it in a linear mixed effects model, compare it to those military operations versus non-military operations. They adjusted their models for some demographic things, age, gender, comorbidities. They had a few other things besides diabetes they were concerned with, like ischemic heart disease, also the year and season of the test. Finally, like we sort of already discussed already, population was dichotomized at 7 kilometers, that distance away from the Gaza Strip, and then also diabetes status. And then like you'll notice one of these, it was like a week long. It was only like a week. The other one was over a month. So they ran the models for each individual, each one of those 3 military operations. And then we'll look at their figures. So these are their demographics. The things to kind of note here was, you see they have it split between up to 7 kilometers. So those folks close to the Gaza Strip, the ones further away. The people living close to the Gaza Strip they're just a little bit older. They had less hypertension and less ischemic heart disease. So a little bit healthier, but a little bit older, and a really similar prevalence of diabetes groups. I was never really able to understand how they were reporting their glucose, 32 milligrams per deciliter. I've met a few people who can carry on a conversation at that level, but not very many. But that's how they reported it. And then this is the results for their overall study. So if you were living within that 7 kilometers from Gaza Strip, your fasting glucose was 2.1% higher on military operation days than any of the tests on non-military operation days. And then a similar but kind of weaker effect, if you're over 7 kilometers, it was 1.1% higher on those military operation days. Here, they're sort of stratifying it even further. You see them add in the diabetes status. That's no diabetes. They do have diabetes and they're medicated, or they do have diabetes and no medication. And the significance here is that this really confirms other diabetic stress research in the sense that diabetics are more susceptible to stress and have more glucose fluctuation, with the exception of this kind of pesky result right here. But everything else kind of supported that. And then this was that when they ran the models for each one of those individual military operation periods. And you may have picked up on it already. Not a ton of statistical significance over here in the p-values. But an interesting discussion point was maybe the suggestion of almost dose response. The longer operations seem to have a higher effect for the most part. So at least some interesting discussion there. Overall, I thought they had some pretty significant findings and like a really unique population. It was a compelling research question that they took a really creative approach to and wound up with a really large sample size and a lot of data. And furthermore, just like on a personal level, trying to understand the article and their methods, I found myself researching the conflict a lot in the region and like what's happening there now. So I thought it was nice to draw some attention to kind of a unique population. And then there are certainly some limitations to the study design and the methods, and I thought they discussed them really appropriately, pretty thoroughly. So I enjoyed that. As far as weaknesses or things I'd like to see different, their controls for the non-military operation days was a little tough for me. It was just, so they really clearly identified these military operations, tons of mortar fire, alert sirens, right? But what about like small arms fire or just general human like other difficult things in a war zone? It left a lot of room for kind of confounding those comparisons. And I found myself wondering, what about ceasefire days or other like scheduled non-conflict days? I think that could have been a good consideration. When they describe their data analysis, hey, anything that's normally distributed, here's how we tested it, and so on and so forth. But they didn't say what parts of their data sets were normally distributed or not. And I think just a couple of sentences there would really strengthen that description. And yeah, they didn't talk about really in any depth about how they managed these 408,000 glucose tests or consent or how it was managed or secured or again, just maybe a few sentences or a paragraph about that would have like connected some dots in my head anyway. But and then finally, no discussion about this. I thought was interesting. They didn't really. I think even like speculation as to why that might be or other findings in literature, even animal models or something, would have made for great discussion. But now for our own discussion. A few questions to, if you don't have any for your own, but the first one I thought I'd put out there was what kind of study design is this?
I actually have a question that goes along with this. So
Oh, good.
did they like use like the same group of individuals and they were getting multiple samples from each individual, or did they just have like all the samples and then they had like some number associated with it?
Yep, that was my impression. So the paper published in 2020, and they think they had their data set complete when they started the paper and then did their analysis.
So did they know if there were like multiple samples from the same people or not?
I see. Yes. I would have to look back to the first part of the paper. I think they prioritized having a minimum of 4 samples.
Okay.
So there were samples on military operation days and control days. They were included in the study.
Okay.
I don't think this was an a priori study. I think it was, as far as I can tell, it's an archival study. Like, we have this data, what happened during this time? Oh yeah, we were being bombed on these, on various days and some not on days. What can we look and see is different for people who are getting bombed versus those who are not on a given day? So I think it was really an archival analysis.
Yes. Yeah, that was my impression too, like a retrospective environmental study kind of thing, just like the 10,000 foot level, exactly like Dr. Allen said, like, hey, here, somehow they got access to this huge pile of data and then ran the numbers a little bit.
Yeah. Kind of getting into that, the ecological aspect of it. I mean, we tried to tie how close the proximity was to whatever data they had and how accurate that could have been is certainly suspect to me. If you live greater than or less than 7 kilometers, like how accurate is that? Is that
right? Does that mean you never travel within 7 kilometers at any point?
Or is that even where they live? I mean,
or where they just got tested, right?
Yeah.
It's just hard to kind of tie that kind of data with that kind of numbers. I think if I understand correctly, Israel's got one of the best epidemiological kind of collection systems in the world, like Iceland or Norway or something like that.
Yeah, so a little bit more description than the slides gave. They were testing at like hospital sites or whatever, and with their inclusion criteria, they were going off of whatever with their registered profile, whatever their home address was, and then does that fall within the 7 kilometers or not? But part of their discussion was saying people could have moved in the middle of the conflict or not with their profile, or they didn't have any sort of control. Exactly that.
I also think it's interesting to think about just a baseline level of what stress is if you're living in a place like
Yes.
Gaza, just even, and not a wartime, their
Mhm.
level of day-to-day stress is probably much different than what a typical American would face. So I just thought that was interesting, like how they define stress and whether the spikes would be the same in other places that have different geopolitical dynamics.
Yeah. Yes. Thank you for bringing that up. Mostly because it gives me a chance to show my cards, right? The reason I was studying this article over the summer was to use it as a reference, something that I was writing about a project of my own. And this was the only, it was the only piece of literature that I could find that was relevant to some of the findings from my own study. And so and that's like what all these questions are about, right? So it's just like, there's a ton of, holes in the methodology and whatever else, but it was the only thing out there that sort of provided some like historic or like point of comparison within the field. And so to Bubba's point, right, I was shocked after reading their methods and their background that they had a difference of 2%. That was like unbelievable to me, that in the sense that it's so small, right? So like they must just be living like right here, and then the days when they have the mortar fire, it bumps a little bit up or something. I did a study with putting continuous glucometers on some firefighters, and about half of the group, between days that they're on shift at the fire station and days they were at home, taking the average of their fasting glucose values for those periods, more than half of the group was over 10% different. Some people were 20% different between those states. And that's not point comparisons, that's average for the study. So that's, this is my interest in there.
I mean, it's just a demonstration of you can detect a very, very small effect when you have a very, very large sample.
Mm-hmm.
Whether or not the effect is practically important is a secondary question. Then one other comment not related to that is just, as scientists in general, I think these scientists did a great job of taking advantage of an unfortunate natural experiment. Many of us had to do this during the pandemic. We had trials interrupted, studies delayed, and your ability to, so you have access to a population or a sample, they're experiencing something. So, kudos to the scientists for, they were probably running a big diabetes or metabolism trial. And then they just went, you know what? We have the opportunity to see if stress is causing a bump in blood sugar.
One of my thoughts too, and this is very different, but the availability of the kinds of food that would be going on during the longer period wars could potentially change individuals' glucose levels as well. It's just something I was thinking about.
Yeah, totally. And that's what we read so much about these days, right? I don't think that the nature of the conflict and the logistics of the region was the same at that point as it is now. But yeah, it just brings to light, especially when you want to talk about some glucose levels and how variable and dependent they are. It's a good point.
So I think a lot of times in this group, we really focus on, if it doesn't have a longitudinal component, which this sort of does, that it can't be causal. And one of the limitations that they mention in this is that it's not causal, which given the analysis that they did, that is correct.
Fair.
But this thing in my mind just kind of screams out for kind of causal inference methods like difference in differences. Because you've got two groups that have different treatment levels of stress, assuming we trust the data, right? Like that's the huge asterisk that sits before anything. But this would be like an excellent application to use some sort of method like that, which would give you something approximating causal evidence.
Wow, yeah, that's an interesting thought, because it is, you know, almost 100% difference between the two groups.
Just since we were kind of talking about confounding variables, I think the omission of a discussion on sleep was kind of something that I was missing out of this article, given that we know that sleep has a big relationship with stress and glucose levels. So I think, and obviously if you're in a military active place, you're probably going to not be sleeping very well. And I also think that could potentially be an explanation to why there was a weaker effect in more remote locations, because we know that people just in general sleep better in remote locations. So I mean, like, I think there's multiple variables at play here, but I think a mention of sleep would have been good.
Yeah, and that's a really great point, and I think it goes under that category of like even just a couple of sentences, you know, mentioning, I think would really strengthen. I think I'll say that.
And like you mentioned before, it's kind of revolving around blood glucose. And, you know, we've heard that there might be famine going on there, and I feel like that's an important factor to leave out if you're discussing how blood glucose affects everything else, because, you know,
Yeah,
you get that through the biggest factor in what your blood glucose is. I think that's really about.
I just had a question, and maybe you covered this, but, and I know this is kind of maybe more primarily an American thing, but did they discuss at all what the prevalence of diabetes was there?
yes, it was almost exactly 31%, both of the geographic.
Which is why I think it's a diabetes trial, because that's oversampling. The prevalence is lower than that in the general population.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like there's a convenient sample of people who were going in to get glucose tests anyway. So you don't get a glucose test if you're a fasting glucose test if everything's fine, usually.
It wasn't part of just the overall workup, or I thought they were just grabbing.
They didn't go into detail as far as like what procedures or screenings people were coming in for. It was just like Dr. Allen was saying, it was like, hey, here's our pool of 400,000 results that we do have.